Very much. I'm super stoked that we've got people here. I don't know, you know, last time I gave a USDA lunchtime seminar, it was Dan. That was the only person that showed up. Dan and 30 sandwiches. So this is much better. I'm really excited. This is an input into a paper that we're writing that was around a conference we ran last fall. And the title is a little bit cut off because we're using a different projector because the projector in the main room was really dark. So we're using an ad hoc projector. So it's a little cut off. The methodological advances, and I want to make sure that you've got the right expectations. A lot of what I'm going to talk about are advances we should be making rather than advances we actually have made. And I don't know if everybody knows CBEAR, so I just wanted to give just a quick summary of CBEAR. So CBEAR's got core funding from Economic Research Service. It's co-directed by myself and Kent Messer. Kent is right over here. And we've got a whole bunch of postdocs for that CBEAR that both University of Delaware and Johns Hopkins support. Can you guys raise your hand? The CBEAR postdocs, great. And PhD students. There we go. All right, and we have a few that weren't able to come today. They're going to come to some of the other seminars. We've got NIFA funding to specific projects and some from some private philanthropic organizations like the Penn Foundation. And we've got two main emphases at CBEAR is to bring insights from the behavioral sciences to agri-environmental programs, from economics, psychology. It's all about human behavior change, so we should be taking more insights from the behavioral sciences and embedding them into program design. And the second key feature is to create a culture of experimentation in agri-environmental programs, both within USDA, USDA partners, and within academia. And we also have a role with disseminating evidence along these lines. I just want to be clear on when we mean experimentation, because sometimes we present this to program people in our CSFSA, they say we experiment all the time. We're constantly trying new things. And when we talk about experiments, I'm sure you already know this, but we're talking about controlled experiments, right? Not experiments in the lay term that we're just sort of doing things and seeing what happens, but where you actually manipulate program features or program interventions in a way that you can elucidate the underlying causal impacts and the mechanisms under which they operate, right? Because it makes the learning so much easier when you do it deliberately, when you embed things in programs to learn and use randomization to do that. And I want to emphasize, a lot of times people think that CBEAR is really approaching this like we want to see if the CRP works or EQIP works, what are the impacts of these programs, and that's an important issue. But we're more interested in trying to improve program designs and in the process learn about the underlying behavioral principles that are going to make all the programs better. I just want to give you an example of a kind of experiment we're running. So in the Mississippi River Basin, there's a particular issue with a lot of the land is managed by non-operator landowners. And the take-up of conservation practices, particularly around nutrient management, is very low on these properties. And there's lots of hypotheses about why that is. Right? This is not like a sexist thing, why there's a female and a male there, but this is, according to Purdue University's qualitative work, a lot of these non-operator landowners are older women, and a lot of the producers, the operators that are working on it are males. And there's a lot of hypotheses about why we don't see the take-up, that there's lack of information, that there's transaction costs, there's technical assistance needed, or it's just more costly because you have this intermediary, we need to pay them more in cost-share programs. Right? These sorts of hypotheses, is it information? Is it a transaction cost or some kind of psychological biases? Is it purely just a rational cost-benefit decision? The benefits don't outweigh the cost. These pervade all the USDA programs. And we don't have a lot of insights. We have people arguing back and forth. So with Purdue University and TNC and CBEAR, we've designed an experiment to target NOLs and start to elucidate. So we're looking to see, well, how do we get them to adopt conservation practices? But we're also interested in figuring out what are the barriers and design the experiment to try to shed some light on those barriers. So we designed an experiment with about 2,500 producers, NOLs, non-operator landowners who have not done cover crops in the past, but said that they were interested in learning more about it, and randomize them into 3 groups. One that just gets typical information, testimonials, a guide to how to do cover crops and why they're important. One that gets a lease template. One of the hypotheses is the problem is that the landowners don't know how to get a lease that has conservation practices and particularly a way of sharing, the cost share payments that might come from that. And then the third group augments that with just more money, $1,500 extra if you can show that your lease includes, in this case, cover crops. That's what we're focusing on. And those are randomized across the groups. And again, it's not because anyone thinks that these particular interventions are something to scale up within USDA, but more that we're trying to get at, is it lack of information? Is it some kind of the transaction cost? Is it a financial issue, cost and benefits, that's preventing the uptake of a particular conservation practice? And clearly we can expand it. I mean, something we're trying to talk right now is with USDA, NRCS, and NACD, National Association of Conservation Districts, is adding another treatment arm in a replication that involves technical assistance. If people are familiar with this experiment from the financial aid for college-bound seniors, where they try to reduce the complexity of applying for that college aid and showed a big uptake in participation in taking up that aid and going to college. And that's what a lot of the technical assistance programs are there for, this underlying assumption that something's stopping people from doing their own conservation plan, from filling out the paperwork and learning out the programs. We need to give them assistance. It would be interesting to test that hypothesis rather than what we typically do is we argue back and forth about what are the barriers underlying participation in these conservation programs and agricultural programs more broadly. But what I want to talk about today is not that experiments are useful for learning, but they're really useful for doing credible science and making credible science easier to do. All right, so to say what I mean or to explain what I mean, I want to just give you the starting point for this presentation. It's this workshop that we organized back in the fall with NIFA money, right? With NIFA money, support from NIFA, that brought in academic people who were working on behavioral and experimental to present their work. It was a great conference, a lot of young people, and lots of things where they're embedding programs in real conservation actions, like working with local NRCS or FSA offices, using administrative data that's already out there. So a lot of really interesting advances. But there were a lot of common problems in all the designs. And this is common throughout the agricultural econ and the agricultural research field in general. So it's not great, because I'll read them out. The first one was low power, low statistical power, and a complete absence of power analyses. And I'm going to talk about these, at least the first two, in more detail in a minute, but I just want to list these. Second one was multiple comparisons. A lot of these studies had multiple interventions. They were studying multiple outcomes and often looking for subgroup effects, looking at males versus females, looking at older versus less older, younger, looking at more educated, less educated. The problem with these multiple comparisons is if you're not controlling the type 1 error rate, you are bound to find statistically significant results. So a lot of presentations where, well, we looked at 10 different outcomes, and for 2 of them, they were statistically significant. For the other 8, they were not. And then there was a whole story about those 2. This is a big problem throughout the agricultural econ and broadly science in general. Lack of clarity about which estimands were identified by randomization. There was often a mix of things that they randomized that they were talking about in a causal way and things that were not randomized that they were still also talking about in a causal way. And number 4, a lack of clarity between, in the research question, what questions are we posing or what are we trying to do that's predictive and what are we trying to do that's causal? And most of the things that we do, there's a mix of both in clarifying what is the predictive part and what's the causal part. Causal, does X cause Y and by how much? Predictive, as an example, for which subgroups does X cause Y and by how much? The second one is a predictive question, right? More educated farmers are more responsive to technical assistance than less educated farmers. That is not a causal, that is a predictive question. And there's lots of advances going on the prediction side of machine learning that people might be getting familiar with that are not being taken advantage of in the ag econ. And when they are, they're often taken advantage of to answer causal questions, which is not what they're designed to do. And we saw a lot of that mixing up in there. And then also the last one related to that is mixing up what are we doing to identify the causal effect and what are we doing to estimate it more precisely. And so we saw things like people running an experiment and then using fixed effects or difference in difference estimators to estimate the treatment effects, which is a terrible idea. That there's no reason, what you're doing is you're killing all the good variation and the bad variation, but there is no bad variation in the experiment. So all you're doing is killing the good variation, therefore making it harder to detect the treatment effect. And we saw, again, a lot of that confusion going on, and we're going to be having a special issue in environmental resource economics, highlighting these papers and then highlighting some of these issues. The first one I want to talk about, because I'm not sure that all of these are really familiar to people, and one of the main goals is that I think ERS and NIFA, as well as others that are funding research, it's not just experimental research, research more broadly, need to push a higher standard. And it'll become clear why I'm going to be making that case, that we've got to have some effort from above to improve things on these dimensions. So just so I know, how many, the audience knowledge, how many people know what type M and type S errors are? Okay, good. All right, so let me just start with an example from the behavioral science and an important one that could be applied to ag environmental programs. This issue of how you frame incentives, not just how much you give people, for instance, but how you frame it can matter in terms of the behavioral response. Right? So let's say that we have a situation where somebody can perform with the 50 action unit, like up to enrolling 50 acres in riparian buffers. Right? We could have a typical, what's called the gain frame contract. This is what we typically see. You start with 0, and we tell the person for every action you perform, every acre you enroll, you'll receive $100 up to $5,000. Right? Could be a cost share payment or incentive payment. An alternative that you rarely see is what's called a loss frame contract. You start with the highest amount the person can earn, and you say, for every action you don't perform, you'll lose $100. Right? They're isomorphic, they're the same exact contract. But psychologists argued for decades that losses are weighed more heavily than equivalent gains. Often the argument is 1.5 to 2 times more they're weighed. And if that's true, then the loss frame contract could induce greater total effort. So we're talking about just a change in the framing, costless, essentially. Right? You have to change all the materials that you put out there, but it's essentially costless, can induce greater effort, action, or success. All right? There have been about 16 experiments, field and lab experiments, testing loss frame versus gain frame context using real effort. Most of them, except for the 2 at the bottom, are stated effort. The others are real. People actually have to work, and they get paid as a function of how successful they are. And they apply the loss frame contracts on average, increase effort or success at the incentivized task. And a former grad student and I just did a meta-analysis. And again, overall weighted average of about 1/3 of a standard deviation increase in effort as a result of just changing the framing to loss frame. So I don't know if you're used to thinking about standard deviation effects, since they all use different outcomes. Some people are cutting paper, some people are working in a factory, some are teachers trying to get their students to perform better. So everything's done in terms of standard deviations, but 1/3 of a standard deviation, that's big. That's really quite large for just almost a costless change. So you can see there's all the studies and if analysis. This is the overall effect of about 1/3. I'm going to reframe this picture in what's called a funnel plot. I don't know if you've ever seen these in meta-analyses. So just take a look at what on the vertical axis is the standard error of the estimate. Right? So 0 would mean there's no sampling variability, and it goes down from there. It gets bigger, the sampling error. The precision gets lower as we move down toward the origin. And then across the horizontal axis, we have the standardized mean difference, the fraction of a standard deviation that the loss frame contract has on effort. Right? So that mean that we were talking about before is right there, 1/3 of a standard deviation, 0.31. So we've got field experiments, labs, stated effort. What do you see in this graph? Like, what are some of the things that you notice? Don't be afraid, just more things out there. The less precise, that's right, less precise the estimate, the bigger the treatment effect for loss framing. That's one thing. What else? There aren't any wrong answers. You can just throw it out there. Not a judgment. So, what? or best, you mean biggest impact, right? So it looks like, it's not exactly clear, but there's certainly a lot more of the circles are down here. So they're both the big treatment effects are also the less precise estimates. Right. The other thing, it may not be super obvious off the bat, but once I point it out, it's going to be obvious, is as you move down, decrease the precision, there's an enormous amount of white space here. Right? There are no studies showing zero or something close to zero small effects or negative effects. Why do you think that is? Publication bias. In what way? What do you mean, Dan? Boring, if they're smaller, but these are some of these that are smaller, like these, like Levitt, and some of the others are published in good journals. Boring and uncertain, right? They don't pass the typical thresholds for statistical significance. Right? So look at the sample sizes on these. Not surprisingly, the lab stuff is small sample size. These are total sample sizes. The stuff that's more precise are bigger, right? Whether it's field or lab. This is a huge problem in experimental behavioral, these small sample studies that are generally woefully underpowered. If you remember the confidence intervals for even some of those things that are better powered, they were still quite large. Right? One exception is a study that Dustin Tracy and I did where we designed it to try to be able to measure the effect more precisely. But even those seem like large sample sizes, 300, 800, 950, they're actually just barely adequate. And the small ones are down here, and we don't see, what you should see in this plot is sort of a mean value, and you should see estimates on either side, right? There should be noise on either side, but you're not seeing this. This sort of picture, we see a lot of things shifted out in one direction, suggests there's publication bias, like Dan said. And this idea that low statistical power leads to inflated estimates is one that not everybody's familiar with. Everybody's familiar with low statistical power means type 2 errors are really likely, meaning that there is a real effect. I will fail to see that effect most of the time I run this experiment, right, roughly. But the opposite problem is what people have labeled type M error or inflation error, is this idea that the only effects that are going to pass a statistical significance test are really large ones. If we assume the treatment is modest, small, like we expect a lot of things in the behavioral science, econ or otherwise, the only thing that's going to pass the magic threshold of p less than or equal to 0.05 is something really large, right? Now this is set up for power equal to 0.06 because coming from a particular field where they found power is actually below 10% in most of the studies. And they're showing that the things that are going to get published are 9 times as big as the actual treatment effect. Right? That's what you're going to see published. It's not a huge deal to have low power designs if we're getting stuff on both ends. This is called type S, where you actually get the opposite sign with quite high probability and statistically significant. Because if we published everything, we get a bunch of this stuff, we get a bunch of this stuff, and then you do a meta-analysis that try to do medicine, and you get the actual estimate. But the problem is, all this white stuff doesn't get published. Sometimes this will have trouble getting published because it doesn't make any sense. Nobody believes that you get this completely opposite from the popular wisdom. If this is the popular wisdom, this is what you get. If loss framing is such a big thing, we should find an improvement in it, this is what we end up getting published. So it's not that there's no treatment effect. It's just that the stuff that you read in the literature is grossly overestimating what these treatment effects are. Right, so here's, and it's not, again, it's not just the behavioral sciences. Every field suffering from this. This is part of the replication crisis. This is one element of it that every field is now in the throes of. This is from a neuroscience recent paper. Just again, slightly different assumptions, but giving you this idea of how the bias, this inflation bias, is a function of the power in the study, showing that it goes to 0 as we get closer to 100% power 80% is sort of the magic number that people often go to. It says low, but for studies that have 10 to 20% power, inflation is really large. And even for things that 40 or 50% is still quite large. And an important thing, I don't know if you've seen this paper, was published last year. The first author is a statistician who's made a career out of showing that most scientific research is false. Right? So he's been going to basically every field and examining that field, and they went to econ, published this last year in the Economics Journal, where this is observational by and large. There's experiments in here, but most work in economics is observational, meaning non-experimental. 159 empirical economics literatures, meaning labor and monetary economics and health. 64,000 estimates of economic parameters, more than 6,700 empirical studies. Half of the research areas have nearly 90% of their results underpowered. The median power is 18%. Right? So there's an assumption in there that you can play with, that you can get lower power and you get slightly higher power, because obviously we can't measure retrospectively power. But the key punchline is that economics is woefully underpowered and therefore very prone to this type M error that when it interacts with publication bias leads us to grossly overestimate the impact. No. Almost, so 95%, I would guess, 96% of this review are non-experimental studies. That's why I want to make it really clear that I'm talking a lot about experimental, that's what CBEAR does. This problem is pervasive throughout all science, including all of economic science, not just experimental or the behavioral economics literature. In fact, what I'm going to try to argue is that experiments are doing a lot better, and there's certain characteristics of experimental work that lend themselves to doing a much better job around these issues. All right, so and then they say that nearly 80% of the reported effects in these empirical economic literatures are exaggerated, typically by a factor of 2, and with 1/3 inflated by a factor of 4 or more. So again, how is that? What's going on? We already talked about this issue of publication bias. Again, underpowered is okay because this means we're just going to get lots of variation in what's published, but we're not seeing that. Right? And here's an example. Steve Wallander led this paper with Nate Higgins and I. We embedded an experiment in the Conservation Reserve Program to try to increase participation during a general sign-up from producers whose contracts were expiring. There was basically just a reminder treatment number 1, a reminder plus some extra norming, and then a treatment 3 that had much more enhanced social norms to try to get people to not only participate, but to do more conservation practices per dollar bid. And the punchline here is that there is a treatment effect. These are compared to a control group that got nothing. It's a small effect. It's statistically different from 0. The sample size is very large, almost 47,000 producers in 4 treatment arms. So this is highly powered study. But they're small, and you can't see any differences across the 3 treatments. Right? They all look to be more or less the same. And in our first review, we submitted this to AJAE, where it eventually got published. But the first review, the editor summarized the key aspects of the reviewers, and the first one was reviewer 3 finds a small / no impact of the treatment to reduce the contribution of this paper. Right? That is exactly the problem. That if we had found these enormous, ridiculously enormous effects for just sending simple letters, people would have been really excited. That's the wrong reaction. People should have instead been really skeptical that that's plausible. But instead, they have the opposite. Small, you don't find any differences across the treatments. That's not really worthy of putting in a good field journal. And the other 2, and this is the issue I talked about, multiple comparisons, felt like you got to push the data more. Like go into that data and start looking to see if there's some that are bigger treatment effects than others. Right? And we pushed back against both of those, right? Because I don't remember, we didn't do much of this either. It was ex post and exploratory. So that's the key. It's okay to sort of explore your data further, right, and point to possible areas for research by breaking down your sample into, Midwest versus the Northeast versus the South, older farmers, younger farmers, farmers who participated more, participated less in conservation programs. But recognize you're slicing up the data, and it's really easy to find statistically significant effects. You don't want to make believe that was the original intent of the study and have a whole narrative that goes around it. But yet, there's pressure both from within ourselves that we want to get credit for all the work we've done, and externally in our discipline to generate large statistically significant effects, which then makes it so that our evidence base is not terribly strong, in which we can build better programs. So this is just a very simple adjustment, one could call trim and fill. It basically looks at this funnel plot and says, down at this area, we've got a problem of missing studies. There must be some studies out there that were done that didn't show what you would get published and they never got out there. So let's pretend they're in there and re-estimate the treatment effect, right? So trim and fill is pretty coarse, but if you did that, you go down to 1/10 of a standard deviation, and the confidence interval goes from just about 0, a little bit less, to about 0.2. And by and large, as more and more studies do bigger sample sizes, more rigorous designs that are planned out in advance, this is what people are starting to find, is that most of what we do has small effects. A lot of it doesn't work at all, and we can't even detect it with even highly powered designs. That we should, instead of glorifying these really large treatment effects that we're finding in the literature, a huge advance would be to start treating them much more skeptically and look more carefully at some of the design features. Because all I've talked about right now is just low power, but it assumes that the rest of the design is just fine, right? But that you add on these other problems, like endogenous sample selection. This is a huge problem in all sciences, including economics, both experimental and non-experimental. What do I mean by this? So in experimental context, traditionally people would go into the lab, they say, let's get about 30 to 50 students in here. We do the experiment, we look at the treatment effect and go, oh boy, that looks like what, that's where we're thinking about, our hypothesis says it'd be positive, it's just barely insignificant, let's run a few more sessions. Run 2, nothing, 3, nothing, 4, there it is, and we stop. Same thing with observation, though. We put a bunch of data in there for maybe 2 or 3 states. We look at the effect. Looks really interesting, but not quite statistically significant. Let's bring in a couple more states. I bring in 1, 2, boo, there it is. I'm done. I stop. That's where my sample stops. Right? And we may be, we're not doing it to be devious, but that's a huge problem. The whole frequentist statistics that we do, t-tests and chi-square tests, f-tests, and confidence intervals, all depends on having the sample size set in advance, not selecting and moving along. If you've ever seen a simulation, as you bring in more sample size, you'll find the p-value, for example, just fluctuating all over the place, going down towards 0, going up, as you might imagine. That's the whole idea, is as you take more and more samples over and over again, you're going to see a whole variety of outcomes. That's what sampling variability is all about. And we're actually confusing ourselves and thinking that as I add more sample size, how could I be getting away from the truth? Right? I must be getting closer to the truth. You just told me in the previous slides that bigger sample sizes were better than smaller sample sizes. And that's true when you set it in advance, not when you endogenously select that sample. P-hacking, more and more people know this idea. This is essentially working with the data until you get those p-values down, changing the estimator and convincing yourself that you've got the right one now, or getting rid of outliers. And this has been a standard problem people have talked about for a long time. And of course, there's deliberate fraud. And all this means is that even if we were doing things well, just mixing this low-powered studies with some publication bias grossly skews the evidence base that we're creating. And you throw more of this stuff on top of it, and it gets even worse. And so when I'm talking about advances in agri-environmental research, and it's more broad than that, is dealing with these problems, right? Not having fancier estimators, fancier ways of dealing with clustered standard errors, is doing better design so that the results that are coming out of them are going to be far more useful. Right? So I don't know if people have ever heard of Peter Rossi, he's a famous guy in social program evaluation. And he has this paper where he has these metallic laws. And this first is the iron law of evaluation. The expected value of any net impact assessment of any large-scale social program is 0. Right? And basically this idea that most programs, most interventions we do not work. But you wouldn't get that impression if you actually read the scientific literature or the social science literature. And the other is the stainless steel law. The better designs the impact assessment of a social program has, the more likely is the resulting estimate of net impact to be 0. Now, these are supposed to be somewhat funny and coarse, but getting at this underlying issue and trying to reorient people's ex-ante expectations. Don't expect things to be big. That's actually where things you should be quite skeptical of. The Arnold Foundation really promotes better evaluations of social public programs. Put out a paper recently, basically trying to cheer up their troops who are doing really good designs and finding nothing repeatedly over and over again, small effects or no detectable effects. And they had this paper trying to cheer people up and showing evidence that this is the way it actually ought to be. And they mentioned that Google and Microsoft have done over 13,000 experiments. This is during like a 5-year period. 80 to 90% reportedly found no statistically significant effects. This is what we should expect to see, and we don't see that. So I'm going to give you another example from our CBEAR work. So this is on the issue of anchoring. So I don't know how many people know anchoring, but anchoring had been around for a while, but it really took off in the 70s with Tversky and Kalman's science paper that had a bunch of different experiments in them. One of them was this experiment, where they spun a roulette wheel that was rigged to come out to either be 65 or 10. They asked the subjects to write down the number and then asked them, and it was randomly assigned to them through the wheel itself, is the percentage of African nations among UN members larger or smaller than this number? Right? The number that comes off the roulette wheel. Then they ask them to guess what's the percentage of African nations among UN members. And they found subjects who received 65 as their anchor had average estimate almost double the estimates of subjects who received anchor of 10. And there's been lots and lots of anchoring studies showing double, triple, 400% increase in stated preferences, behavior, estimates, risky decision making. And I don't know if you've read his Fast and Slow book, but he's got a chapter on anchoring. And he defines it as people consider particular value for unknown quantity before estimating the quantity. What happens is one of the most reliable and robust results of experimental psychology. One of the most reliable and robust results of experimental psychology. The estimates stay close to the number that people considered, hence the image of an anchor. Right? And I want to be clear, I don't have any problem with that anchoring might be a real phenomenon. In fact, we've done some work in this area, but the claims are that it's enormous in effect, right? Here's a QJE article called Coherent Arbitrariness by Dan Ariely and some others, where they did a whole bunch of anchoring experiments in willingness to pay, willingness to accept in competitive and non-competitive situations. And they found that by changing the anchor around, what this arbitrary number that you had people think of or focus on before they actually went and did their choices, affected by their willingness to pay and willingness to accept by as much as 200%, and a minimum of 50%. And their argument was that as they gave people more valuable things to bid on, the bids went up. So that's where the coherent part comes from. But the problem was that they could just switch this anchor around and find people vary. That's where the arbitrariness comes around. And they basically said this undercuts entire econ theory and these results. Inspired by a lot of that work, CBEAR, we've been running this program called AgVise, and it basically has farmers bidding in auctions for cost share contracts related to agri-environmental practices like riparian buffers, feral hog traps, a variety of other impure public goods. And inspired by the anchoring work, when people go into the bidding interface on the computer, this is a real auction, real money, thousands of dollars on the table here. We just randomize whether their bid, initial bid starts at 0%. Cost share means that they don't want to pay any of it, or 100%, meaning they'll pay the full amount of the cost of the practice on their property. And what we find is that subjects that are assigned the 100% starting bid have an equivalent to a $1,400 difference in their bid, a 10 percentage point increase in the amount that they're willing to cost share. Right? 10%, that's 10 percentage point. It's pretty high, given that all you did was change where the slider is. It's not 50 to 200%. And the thing we're a little concerned about is we had 537 people go through, learn about the auction, and be offered the bid, but only 178 participants placed the bid. Now, almost 200, that's a decent sample size, but in these bidding environments, you actually need more to have adequately powered studies. So we're a little concerned that this might be inflated, even though it's much smaller than what you see there, because the practical implications are huge. If you could just change the interface a little bit in the competitive market for agri-environmental contracts and get that big of a change in people's, how much you have to pay out to producers to do the practices, that would be a big thing. So we've been playing with this idea in other contexts, but really trying to focus on the sample size issue. So this is HomeVISE. We're not very creative in the names, right? So everything is the VISE stuff. But this is about residential households dealing with nutrient runoff from their lawns and their properties. And we're trying to induce them to take up technologies that would reduce the runoff on their properties. And so they know they're in a research project, but they're encouraged to bid on these products. And they're using a Becker to group Marshak. They're not bidding against anybody else. They're bidding against not bidding against anybody else, they're bidding against a random number, and if that random number is above what they bid, they don't get it. If it's below, they pay that random number price. And the idea is it's supposed to be incentive compatible. I don't really want to get into argument about whether it is or not. All I want to focus on is when we go into that interface, we're randomizing where the starting value starts. They get $25 to participate, and they can use that to bid on the products. And we randomize what dollar value their bid starts on, and then they can move the slider to whatever bid they actually want in there. And what we have is 336 participants. You think that's a good sample size. I'll explain in a minute why it isn't. Placing 5 bids, there's 5 different products. And each was randomized to 1 anchor from 0 to 25, so 26 different anchors. Right? The implication, if you think about that, that means for every anchor value, we have about 13 subjects. We're randomized. Each one of those is a separate treatment arm in the experiment, to which we've only assigned 13 people to each arm. That is underpowered design, right? But when we estimate it, we find the anchor goes from 0 to $15, the average bid increases by about 40%. And this 95% confidence interval is huge. 5% to 75% increase, which is along the lines of what psychologists have found in the past. So we said, okay, let's go back and do this experiment again. Let's make it much more statistically powerful. Let's boost the sample size up to 1,200 people. Let's just do 2 anchors, the extreme, 0% and the full endowment percent. And we did this other manipulation for half the group where we try to even raise the salience of the anchor itself. Give ourselves more power. All right, so we got 1,200 adult participants, 4 products. We got rid of one of the products from the last time because nobody liked it. And what we find, the punchline is that when you go from 0 to $15 and the anchor, that's the starting value of what they're going to pay. It's not where they end up. The starting value affects where they end up by about 5%. And the 95% confidence interval is very tight, 2% to 8%. Right? So the problem is that people look at 5% and they go, but that's really what we should expect for a lot of these interventions, 5%, 10%, 15%. This is like a costless change to me, I'm still shocked that you get a 5% by changing just where that slider starts. That affects where they end up. But it's real money on the table here, both for the farmers and for these homeowners here. But it's not 50%, 200%, 400% that a lot of these underpowered designs demonstrate. Say it again. No, no, no. Oh, yeah, yes, right. But we cluster the standard errors because it's the same person bidding, but that's right. So you get a little extra power from having additional bids, but not a lot because they're highly correlated in the individual. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, that's something we can discuss. I'm not so sure program people are satisfied with 2%, 5%, 6% changes, but we can discuss that. Because our experience has been that when we see competing teams for attention to policymakers who are promoting 50%, 100%, 150, and the policymaker has no way to decide which one is more credible. They're both people with peer-reviewed publications. They both, from good universities. It's not necessarily easy to make that call. Right. Mm-hmm. Right. That's right. But it also had a separate effect that was endogenous, that it's because they wouldn't let anything into that clearinghouse that wasn't well designed, well done, some of the things we've been talking about, it forced the whole field to start doing better. The Department of Education stopped giving out grants to people that didn't have well thought out evaluation designs in the beginning. And so that was another effect that, again, something that CBEAR is pushing, ERS and USDA more broadly, is you talked about, people need to have the right expectations about quality of evidence and what you're going to likely to get. That's an important message to get from within, because that's not something program people necessarily know. They can't decide what's a better design, what's a good design, what's not, and they can't necessarily know what to expect in these contexts. Oh, yeah. Okay, I'll do that next one, because that was I'm going to skip this. This is just, somebody did a replication exactly of that paper I talked about in the Quarterly Journal of Economics and found much smaller effects. But let me just talk, I don't know if you've seen these two science papers, one on psychology, one on economics, that try to replicate lots of studies. So in psychology, huge group of people, that's why they don't even have the author list, it's just called the Open Science Collaboration, replicated 100 studies in the top 3 psychology journals. Nearly all of them reported positive findings, meaning in the desired or theoretically pleasing direction. But in the replications, authors only found a significant effect in the same direction for 36% of the studies. And so look at this graph, and I mean, just take a minute to look at it. So those are all the studies. The sizes of them are based on the power of the circles. The red means not statistically significant, and the green means it is. The original effect size is the horizontal. The replicated effect size is the vertical. That line is actually an estimated regression line through it. It's not the 45. The 45-degree line, which means the estimated matches the replicated, will be pushed up. So the first thing you can see is lots of red, right? That's what this thing said, lots of insignificant, fail to detect, with much more powerful designs than the originals. Second thing is, if you think about that 45 line is, almost all the replications found lower magnitude. Even when they were statistically significant, they were lower than the original study magnitude. Again, that idea of inflated effects, even for real causal effects. And you can see there's a bunch of things that were even in the negative domain, although none of them were statistically significant. And there is a relationship that as the estimated effect size gets bigger in the original, it's more likely to be statistically significant in a replication. So there certainly is, this correlation, but this whole thing shows gross amount of false claims of treatment effects and overestimation of the magnitude. All right, so economics tried to do something similar, only took 18 replications, and they were from a 3-year period and from AER and QJE. And they were very much oriented, a lot of them were papers about monetary incentives, where you kind of think like, those are real. Like, when you change the money, people, change the cost of benefits, people will change their behavior. And what they did is they found they powered them up, so they're all 90% power, pre-analysis plans to prevent them from manipulating the data later. They found a significant effect in the same direction as the original study for 11 replications. So better than the psychologist, but still not great. And again, they found on average the replicated effect size was 2/3 of the original effect size. And people have done this in lots of fields, showing that the first published, especially if it's in a good journal, is always the highest treatment effect you're ever going to see. And any other analyses, the treatment effect goes down after that. All right, so what does this imply? All right, you can barely see it up there. We need power analyses for our studies. This is something CBEAR has been pushing in our small grant program, and Dan was participating in that. We were really pushing our folks. Even if it showed that it was underpowered and that's all they could do in the budget, that was better, so that it was transparent about what they could and could not detect than not having them at all. And what we've been finding as we do more and more of these power analyses in the agri-environmental context is that it's showing that we need much, much larger sample sizes than we've been using in the past. And corresponding with that is fewer research questions. And this comes to the multiple comparison problem. You need large sample sizes, and you can't just keep cutting the data for lots of different research questions from the same data set. That's going to lead to lots of false positives. And for the same reason we talked about before, as you cut the data, you're getting smaller sample sizes, you're going to get inflated estimates of the treatment effects. This is a big issue, right? The fact that we need bigger sample size means more expensive studies, research studies, and fewer questions. So the production function is shrunk in, right? The amount of research questions answered per dollar spent is going to go down as a result from this. And we're finding recruiting farmers is quite expensive. A lot of you may already know this. But for example, Colin's running this experiment on risk and time preferences with farmers in the US. That we're offering $75 for a half-hour incentivized survey, plus the opportunity for 1 in 10 to earn up to $3,000 based on the decisions they're making. And we're getting a 6% response rate. It means we've got to invite 10,000 producers to get the sample size that we need for the 600 people. And the implication is, a lot of you have this advantage, is that best to work within USDA programs that are already working with hundreds and thousands of farmers. And that you already have those large sample sizes. That trying to work outside of those programs is much more difficult and expensive to do. Again, it's pushing this idea you need collaborations between the researchers and the program people. Last thing I want to mention, all right, so power analyses are really important. And it'd be a huge advance if we started requiring them in all studies, experimental and observational. The other is pre-registration or pre-analysis plans. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this idea, but this is what medicine has to do before they do clinical trials. Is they essentially have to write the entire paper in advance, leaving out the results and the conclusions. They haven't run the experiment yet. Everything is worked out. What are the questions? What's the design, the power, the sample selection? What do we do if we have attrition, non-compliance, if things change? What subgroups are we going to look at? You do that before. You don't go afterward, ex post, and start looking through your data to see what you can find. You can do those sorts of things, but those deviations are going to be highlighted in the effects and results reported, meaning that if I do exploratory work that's not part of my pre-analysis plan, I state that in the paper so the reader knows this is post hoc sort of data mining. There might be some interesting insights, but I shouldn't put the same weight on it as the main effects estimated in the paper, right? This sort of stuff is really rare. There's more and more efforts to try to have this done in economics. It's mainly the experimental world that's doing it. But it's really important. Again, a lot of people don't do it because they think it ties your hands unnecessarily. It doesn't. You can update your pre-analysis plans. You can have deviations in the plans itself, when they did a review of medicine, they found that 65% or 70% had deviations from their original plans. Right? So it doesn't bind you to that, but it allows people to better evaluate the credibility of the results when you've had deviations from that, or you did additional analysis you hadn't thought of. Because we find that this has been a pain in the neck. All my postdocs can attest, this is a total pain in the neck to have to work out everything in advance. It's a very big cost. Right? And then you're worried that the experiment might fail. Fail meaning we don't detect the treatment effect, and therefore it's going to be hard to get published, or to convince the funders that that was a useful investment into your research project. But without that sort of shackles that we place ourselves on and better upfront effort in terms of design, we're going to still be getting this problem of power in the teams, inflated estimates, things that are published that don't really reflect the underlying behavioral principles that are out there. I'm going to skip that. These are some places where people are pre-registering. The American Econ Association has one, as well as Open Science Framework is another big one out there, including you can just also use your own website with a credible timestamp. It doesn't have to be super complicated for how you do it. All right, so just closing it up. These problems that we saw at the conference are widespread problems in agricultural domain, in the science domain more generally. This idea of low power designs, multiple comparisons where you're going to find something and then the whole paper is written about as if those were the things that you always intended to find. That pre-analysis plans, by working out the power in advance, it's still an approximation, it's not exact, working out what outcomes you're going to do, keeping that small, what subgroups are the main focus. You can do other ones, but it's clear those are exploratory. The other things I haven't talked about, I haven't talked about them outside of this, but a lot better work on doing the designs and less attention perhaps on things that we historically focused on, some of the statistical fancy fireworks to get at the treatment effects. I think that's all I have. I lost my thing here. Yeah. So we have a few minutes if people have any questions, concerns with this. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, this is a huge problem that people think, people do meta-analyses with data that are probably have huge biases in them. And as we talked about before, as n goes to infinity, the bias doesn't go away, right? Because of this, the process that we've seen that generates those studies that end up in publication. So it's a big problem with meta-analyses that are using input from studies that likely have these biases. In principle, if all things were published, meta-analyses are great because that's their whole intent, is to take underpowered studies and be able to more precisely estimate the causal effects, and to look at moderators that each individual study may have been too underpowered to look at, how things vary geographically, temporally, by the attributes of the particular system you're looking at. But when the stuff going into it has these biases, the stuff coming out are going to be just as bad. Oh, so the question was, I'm sorry, the question was, when we look at meta-analyses like in water quality studies, can we believe those meta-analyses, the results that come out of that? Mm-hmm. Right. Right. That's a great point. So the question is that econometrics text, and more broadly, is the way we even think about these studies, is we don't define what we expect to see as a treatment effect in advance, which is the first step you need to do in power analyses. That is a big problem, that whole idea of forcing someone to think about, well, what do I want to be able to detect, rather than just letting the data speak. And it's always this sort of a misstatement to say, let the data speak. Data never speak without untestable assumptions that go along with it. But specifying that in advance is a critical step that students don't get exposed to. Yeah. Did you have a question, Steve? Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Mm-hmm. So it's a huge problem. We just gave back money to a private foundation because we couldn't get enough power in the design. It was to work on inspections. And some of the stuff we're doing with APHIS is about trying to improve inspection regimes. But the problem is violation data it's got a huge variance. So you need really large sample sizes. And we couldn't generate that from within the programs that we were working with. And so we decided not to do the research project, even though we thought it was a really important question. And we had to go back trying to get more states involved, essentially, to make it happen. The alternative is that what they do in medicine is they say, these are really costly trials. I'll do an underpowered study, you'll do an underpowered study, you'll do an underpowered study, and then eventually someone will do a meta-analysis, and we'll figure out what the effect is. But that's sort of like creating an architecture where we can get people to create inputs. They might get other insights from it, but it's all sort of tentative until we're done. I'm involved in something like that right now where 6 studies are going on, all testing the same intervention. Each one is underpowered, right? And it's just, but when we come together, there gets to be properly powered to look at it. And because we're doing it in multiple sites, we'll have better external validity, more generalizable results. Yeah. Well, that's for that particular. So that is one option to do, is to promote that kind of collaboration, to recognize that no single site can generate the data necessary for credible evidence, and therefore we're going to force collaboration or harmonization across sites. And it's painful. Mm-hmm. Right. So I mean, the pre-analysis plans help a lot with that, because in medicine, they can find out, like, here are a bunch of plans, what happened to the data, right? Nothing got published. They can follow up with that. People often have the data, or at least tell you what happened, so you can approximate the results. And there are a bunch of like that trim and fill, a bunch of methods where people use that require untestable assumptions about that process, like what's missing. And what happens if I were to put it in, how would that change my results? So even in the water quality study, that could be done if you had a better sense of what's actually missing that's not being generated or published. If you abstract it from, p-hacking and other sorts of other problems. If it's purely a power issue, one can at least go through a series of assumptions and see how does that change the overall treatment effect that I'd be estimating from that meta-analysis. I wish I had a uplifting endpoint. Go out there and do it. But I think that you all, because you have a huge amount of administrative data and there's lots of things going on, are in a really good position to sort of help lead this. And as a funder, to kind of push the academics to do a better job along this dimension. Stephen, do you have a question? Yeah. Right. Treatment effects being small. Right. 5%, right. 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 No, that's right. Right, it's a big increase. And you should, in that AJA paper, you did that extra effort to show the benefit-cost ratio, showing it was quite large. And that was a really good contribution there. So I agree, this is, again, part of, we're all used to marketing our research. This is another angle for it, so that we do more credible work, we got to do more effort marketing. I'll give you an example of a NIFA project that we got declined in the water domain, large experiment with lots of producers looking at more efficient irrigation. but because the sample size necessary, we can only answer 2 research questions, and the referee said, all this money to answer 2 research questions? Like, you know, they said this is not worth funding. Right? Whereas when we looked at what got actually funded, single watersheds with 12 research questions that they were going to answer. I mean, it's hard to compete against that unless we can somehow change the frame and make it resonate more with policymakers, funders, journal editors. Yeah, I mean, that's something we learned, is we shouldn't take it as obvious that this is the right way to do the design, that we need to do better work in motivating that for the audience. Yeah. Okay. Mm. The population meaning, you mean the academic population? So the question is, so let me take the first question. So the first question is, are we just looking at the wrong interventions if we have this expectation that most of them are going to be small? I don't think so. I think these ideas of single interventions that are transformative, to change the whole nature of the system, are hard to find ex ante. Right? So I don't think, especially on the behavioral thing, I think the idea is that multiple interventions all sort of accumulating, hopefully not interfering, is the way forward. I think this idea of holding out for silver bullets that will, you know, have a 50%, 100% transformation is not the way to go. Well, that's the big question. Is like, what are the underlying mechanisms? I mean, you talk to the staff; they all have their hypotheses. We need more money. We need more farmer extension agent in contact. We need the farmer leaders, or the leaders in the community, for them to actually step up and do the practice. That's where we should focus. We get those nodes adopting, and that just diffuses out to everybody else. That's where a lot of the work should sort of go. Is not trying to say, let's transform the CRP, but let's get at some of these bigger questions. Use the CRP as a vehicle for looking at what are the barriers to getting more participation, more compliance with the practices, more persistence of the practices over time. That would be where I would focus efforts on. That would be in advance, I think. We let everybody go now? I'll let people go. Yeah, I'll be here afterward if anybody wants to ask more questions, but thanks for your attention.